So welcome to an evening of many worlds, the pluriverse, I think that is the word tonight, of many tables and many simultaneous conversations. And we're delighted to be joined, scattered, hidden in amongst the crowd, distinguished guests with practices that's really resonant with what we're trying to do here, to make worlds and to join worlds. We want to acknowledge Andrea Luca Zimmerman's construct of evocative scenes that are so acutely contradictory yet deeply felt. That complex articulation required in life where refusal, despair, joy, and obscenity play out simultaneously. Manage, Verghese, where is she? Her audacity, I would say, to do architecture that is often not recognized as architecture, daring to invert our binary perception of privacy and publicity and to invite us to play in the garden of earthly delights, as we shall continue tonight. And Lina, somewhere back there. Hello, Lina Ashour's contribution to intersectional research, recognizing the importance of a mode of inquiry where they, the people central to studies, will often talk back to the very spaces they are writing from, reflecting our ingrained coloniality. And Kiara Gilbert, Kiki, who is joining us online, and her poetry that gives voices to the marginalized and from racial discrimination, gender segregation, imprisonment, and victimhood, who also see the significant value of race theories and difference making. I asked myself what may be my non-normative practice. That's the question we're going to ask you tonight. I thought of why I call myself a theorist, that often appear in my biography. And perhaps what I see in the making of theories, the making of worlds. And this is very much in resonance with the opening lines of Bell Hook's essay, which we have distributed with our audience. So she said, "I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away. I saw in theory then a location for healing." Echoing this, I remember Mark Cousins' proposition that theories are what we can feel in the gut, which connects with our childhood ability to conjure many theories of the world, the wandering estrangement where it becomes possible to do things and think of things differently. So I use the making of theories to work in around notions of aliens and alienation, affects and affections, ghosts, angels, noises, and magic. I see these as absolutely integral to architecture, and what architecture can be, but perhaps not allowed to be. I do not ignore, but attempt to work with the knowing that is prior to finding articulation, which is all too easily crushed or diminished by the many authoritative voices and dominant discourses, even when they claim to be critical, dialectical, or decolonizing. If, quote, the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house, unquote, as Audre Lorde reminds us, we need more so too, for a process of undoing, to remake our theories, to fundamentally reinvent practices, to make the hurt go away. So when I worked with PhD students last year on the condition of desiring transitionality, we opened up the understanding of transition not as that which is in between or some kind of a non-descriptive passage, but as a concrete and legitimate location and mode of occupation. I invited Madeleine to talk about her work on queering, and in discussion, we came to revealing conclusion that queering cannot be simply understood as an oppositional stance, but it is fundamental to culture. Without the ability to queer, we would have very little means to come to terms with the impulse to differ, to share, and to occupy our desires, which is where culture arises. By queering, we can again recognize our crucial capability, such as through Hilary Cottom's activism, and the imaginative possibility to aesthetic education, where architecture belongs, learning from Gayatri Spivak. So queering is precisely that possibility to partake in challenges of differences, being empowered yet responsive as a productive location of culture for healing. So today we continue to face the challenge of a certain poverty of being and able to think differently, let alone to do something differently. We still have the significant problem of authority and control, and what amounts to urgent contestation simply reinforces the entrenched power relation, now substituted with different players, carrying new gender and racial tags. This is why we need to make more new theories and practices. We need a very different structure of work and relation, such as the way we're sitting together differently, and something we know queering has the potential to reveal.
Thank you.
Here, I pass on to Maddie.
Thank you. Just seeing if I can get my slides up now. Great. So queer can be a noun, it can be an adjective and a verb. In queer theory in particular, queer is something that we do. It's that verb. In the context of today's event, we propose that we can use a method of queering to challenge our societal norms. And while those norms might include things we all know, like the rigid nuclear family, cis-heteronormativity, the patriarchy, we must notice and dismantle norms that we also might not have realized we've been stuck with our whole lives, like the way we sit around the family dining table, the way that your hair is suddenly too short or too long, how it might be all right to be queer in the church, but not queer and a person of color and a woman no less. How it feels to notice that you've been assimilating for so long and you still don't quite feel normal, and you don't understand why feeling normal is so important to you. So what if we instead lived in a society that no longer commits violence against queer people, women, or people of color? Society commits itself to healing. We look after one another as collective kin, regardless of our identities. This was the question that I really wanted to answer during my fifth-year projects with Madeleine and Inigo, and of course I couldn't fully answer it. Queerness famously eludes any attempt to completely achieve it, but I think I got a little closer to imagining this queer utopia and occupying it myself. Queerness is an ideality. It's queer futurity itself, as Munoz puts it, is a warm illumination of a horizon that's imbued with potentiality. Doreen's HTS course of affect theory really allowed me to experiment with the affective potential of queer aesthetics, which I discovered was a counter-aesthetic against normative symbolism forced upon society. So all the clips that I'm showing behind me, these are all part of that fifth-year project, my attempt to imagine this queered society, changing the way we inhabit domestic space through a series of very strange sort of interventions. Occupy larger communities within architectures that utilize this queer methodology to adapt to the ever-changing needs and values of their diverse users. It was a project that really centered queer identities and their relationships to belonging and to home, to acceptance. They were also a speculative fabulation, part interview testimony, part fictional narrative, supported by a strategy that began from thresholds, explored through interviews with the queer community, material studies, and co-design workshops. It was the beginning, for me at least, of that journey towards Munoz's horizon. And that's one that continues today with this workshop, and I'm hoping for much longer, sort of as I keep exploring this idea of queerness in my own practice. The biggest highlight of these experiments was working with my community. It's clear that intersectional, inclusive design has to be a collective effort. Together, my found family and I started developing a methodology informed by queer futurity that would embrace the many contradicting and ambiguous value systems our found family had brought together to co-design a queer intentional community. But the film I produced here was really just scratching the surface of what this queer future might be like, and that leads me to the objective of today's event. Taking a deliberately radical stance that we need a very different structure of work and relation, as Doreen posited, the intention of the Non-Normative Worlds collaborative seminar series and workshop is precisely to explore and speculate alternative forms of spatial practice. We can really learn from each other about the ways in which we already practice queer and non-normative world making. And by coming together to discuss, debate, and create, I hope that you'll walk away from this session feeling perhaps a little challenged, yet still hopeful for the possibilities of a non-normative world. We've invited Andrea, Manojé, Lina, and Kiki to present their practices before we break out into smaller groups, as you've already done, actually. We're inviting participants to share their own projects, their own questions, their own ways of working with each other and the speakers. Please feel free to use all the materials on the table, all the papers, scribble, draw, create as you wish. And before the end of the event, we'll come together again after those breakout sessions as one big group just before the bar opens, and we can have some sort of informal discussions over drinks at the end. But yes, thank you very much. So I think we'll begin with Andrea. So please.
So I am mainly, my name is Andrea Zimmerman. I'm mainly a filmmaker. And I would like to just show you a film I made recently, which was centering around the nomadic community gardens, and was working with a community who's deeply marginalized, as all the communities actually I work with in the world in some way or another. And I myself also come from this kind of background, so I think it's very important for me to reframe and disintegrate the kind of stereotypes and tropes that exist and actually show the life force that is behind coming together, like a queering of space and non-conforming bodies in particular, and the strength that results from that. So I'm going to just show you the first trailer, then I'm going to say something, and then I'll show you the trailer from a new film which is coming out in January. So this is Here for Life.
Stallions! 3, 2, 1.
You fish, you don't hunt fish.
This is the semantics of it. You know what we mean. The fish are going
No, it's not to
and
do
you
with
go
semantics.
after them. You go after them with sharp objects. It's not an argument. No, it's not an argument. Sorry, I don't think my voice sounds like I'm an open discussion. My voice sounds rowdy, but I don't feel rowdy in this way.
Let it ride, fish will fly, fish will fly, fish will fly, settle pay and fry, settle pay and fry, fish will fly, fish will fly, fish will fly, right another line when too many fish will fly, satisfaction is it, none of action, cause I'm an action, engine, passion, back, I got this, that's that, what's the other
I'm afraid of annihilation.
Okay. So I want to look over there, but I realize when I look over there, I get out of that. Can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, because I like to do this. All right, so my presentation is called Counter Memories.
So good evening, welcome to this.
Oh my God.
And also for the London.
Okay, well, goodbye. Counter Memories, Porous Personhood and Dwelling Against Progress. In that major recent anthology published in 2022, writer and poet Eileen Myles reclaimed pathos from the wretchedness of political rhetoric, also often used in conjunction with media portrayals to marginalize vernacular, unruly, and incomprehensible opposition by those not aligning themselves with an acceptable image citizenhood in places such as, say, London. So Myles urged a resistance to despair, advocating for the right to fullness of one's life and one's own terms, in refusal of this imposition and the implication that simply being oneself in a certain location, often decided by developers, is deeply problematic, which we of course know, but some know more than others. As someone who has emerged into a cultural profile from the societal margins and are all too ignored traumatic registers, and as someone who lives and works with still marginalized and traumatized individuals and communities, and who still lives as one of them in many ways, I'm often required to challenge mediated, naturalized, and even asserted ways of looking at others. Notions of giving voice often erases lives and environments, and crucially masks this process, and hence tethers these lives into trope molds. To work collaboratively, however, is to work with and into life, touching and being touched by experience and encounter, allowing oneself to be porous. In filmic terms, this necessitates a deliberately hybrid and layered form. There are many contradictions emerging from collaboration, and this is the point. The world I'm drawn to is incomplete, and it is a world where often contrary thoughts, feelings, positions, intentions do and can arguably and must coexist. However, who is allowed to imagine in cultural production is closely defined by is often defined by unaccountable, even secreted forms of power. How then to be creative in the face of such structures, to know that suffering manifests variously, often invisibly and circumstantially, never to forget to strive to make a space, and to know how fragile that space is for those less able to participate, to make space inside oneself for what one does not know and may never know. As where I live, in Hackney, in London, in social housing, has changed so dramatically and so quickly, so also has my historic need to conceal my postcode to get a job. I live on the Porto staircase of my block, something I campaigned against for very long. And yet now, being there, I'm grateful for it, that my neighbors are not the millionaires living next door, that they do not engage lawyers to force you to take your chattering parrot inside so they can work, as happened to a friend nearby. To live in a way where we all have to negotiate our communal space, even when there are problems, as a coming together attempting to figure out some of the various, often gloriously incompatible ways of expressing what it is to be alive. Where you find the courage, aged 85 or 92, to squat outside the housing office in a caravan because they say you have a minimum 5-year wait until you qualify for housing, and where this doesn't go unnoticed. But sometimes I just like to say that I'm a filmmaker because people think it's glamorous. But then to explain what kind of film it is that I'm making or what I'm seeking gets complicated. And so occasionally I just sit with the glamorous part and enjoy what it conjures. So I'm going to show you I was going to show you a trailer for art class, but it doesn't work because I have to sign in. So this is my new film, which features Eileen Myles. So I'm using, here's an example. In case you don't know, does anyone here know Eileen Myles or doesn't know? Who knows Eileen Myles? It's so interesting because my generation really does know Eileen. So Eileen is a poet and writer, 75 years old. And my film is about her whole life, so Eileen is the next part of my life in a way. And is a really brilliant poet and activist and writer. And I think the reason why Eileen is unknown a little bit here is because Eileen is also queer, and queer people are often marginalized in a double bind because they then said, oh, it's like you're a woman artist, you're a queer artist, you're this, so you're not allowed to enter the mainstream under the same. And there are many fractions of this. So.
I'm a poor, wayfaring stranger.
I'm going to better close it all so it doesn't happen what happened before. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. If anyone has questions for Andrea, that's where I'm going to be sitting, so feel free to go over. But next off, we have Madeleine.
So, hi everyone. I'm really happy to be here. It's a bit weird for me to be in this room as someone who's not in the background or a chair. So thank you to Maddie and Doreen for putting me on the spot and making me present about my practice. But I'm really excited to get to talk about non-normative worlds because it's something that I've been really interested in for a long time. I think designing ways or strategies to bring about systemic change is a connective thread that kind of spans lots of different aspects of my practice, whether it's the events and exhibitions that Harriet and I organize here as part of the AA Public Program, my teaching in AA Diploma 12 and previously at other institutions, And in my wider practice beyond the AA, that kind of spans policy and curatorial projects. So there's like a range of things on this slide that I've worked on. But my interest really lies in widening who can participate in conversations around architecture and culture, and it aims to connect and empower both individuals and communities to get involved and shape their cities and spaces through their ideas, voices, and lived experiences. So when thinking about how to frame this ambition through queering as a methodology, I kind of panicked and texted Maddie on Sunday, being like, please, can you send me this diagram from your technical studies submission last year? So, and she did, thankfully. So Maddie was, this, as she mentioned, was the student in the diploma unit that I run together with Inigo Mins. And here, as a way to kind of develop a queer methodology for design, she began by setting up a criteria for normative failure. So where objects, spaces, and rituals failed to be normative, according to this criteria she set out, they became by definition queer. And this was such a clear and effective way to test her work, but it was also something that's really stayed with me and helped me shape how I think about the creation of non-normative worlds. So for this presentation, I've looked specifically at 3 lecture series that we ran as part of the AA Public Program. New canonical histories, new models, and new standards. And each of these developed from the one that came before it, but are kind of united as a trilogy for some weird reason by this, like, the first word, new. And I'm going to talk a bit about that too. So the public program has been kind of really trying to engage with diversity in different forms as an ongoing project, to introduce alternative forms of knowledge and strategies to expand the discipline of architecture into a more inclusive space. So this lecture series, New Canonical Histories, was something we began in 2019, and it invited architects, artists, theorists, and a whole host of other people who were questioning, shifting, expanding, or rejecting the art and architectural canon in order to write new histories or retell history from a different perspective. And each lecture was kind of imagined as a chapter in a book that would collectively redefine art and architectural history, covering topics including gender, race, identity, power, climate, labor, politics, history, you know, pretty much everything. And this is a quote from like one of them. I mean, they all are on the AA's YouTube channel. Shameless plug, please watch them. And some of them aren't, because there were lots of ideas that were still being formed, and they kind of, people like wanted to actually just share them with people in the room and not have them online forever. And those are the ones probably that I think about a lot as well. So, but this is a quote from one of the lectures by Samia Henny, who was talking about how really canonical histories have to be continuously challenged and questioned in order to remain relevant and to become more inclusive. And these histories aren't static, but rather continuous, or in continuous flux, as they're redescribed through the lens of the present. These histories aren't new. Typically, they're very old and embedded within contexts and communities, but maybe they are new in how they should become part of the architectural canon. So this series then evolved into new models. In the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests, we invited architects as well as practitioners from other disciplines to discuss how their work can change the models around which society is organized. And these conversations really began to address how we can shift power structures, socioeconomic forces, structural inequalities present in society today, in order to give us new tools to, I think, rethink the world around us, which, you know, we still really need to do. And over the 2 years, I think the series invited so many inspiring individuals and collectives. Lina gave one of them on new models for collective care that I think at a time of isolation during the pandemic felt like getting a really big hug through Zoom. So yeah, it was like a real privilege to be part of those spaces. And a lot of these people were doing amazing work to transform society slowly but surely, through like redesigning institutions, redressing who has access to funding, celebrating the act of rehearsing the revolution, embracing physical and digital spaces of collective care, like I mentioned, and designing forms of community-led practice. So there was like, like a whole lot of things that people had been doing for a long time, but maybe were sharing and thinking about how they could become more widespread models to organize the world, or at least society at large. And that then last year turned into New Standards, which was the series that Harriet and I organized together which was, I guess it has as its aim a goal to kind of identify and confront some of the barriers to architecture, its education and practice, and consider how, I guess, the profession can be opened up to embrace wider forms of creativity. So each event in the series addressed ideas of comfort, going beyond standards as like a bare minimum or lowest common denominator, to question how we measure comfort beyond a one-size-fits-all and provide it in all its nuanced forms. But the most exciting part of it was that the series culminated in a kind of one-day workshop where all the participants returned and in a similar setup to today, gathered in tables around the room to really use the AA as a testing ground for some of the ideas that we had talked about around tables the previous term. And we're now working on an action plan to kind of bring together all the ideas that kind of came out of that day to actually think about how we can make short, medium, and long-term change at the school. And I think in this series, standards, rather than new, was the provocation, because it was really meant to question this idea that there should be a standardized approach and actually how that's really failed us, and how a response can shift to one that prioritizes a spectrum of needs was what we were really looking for, finding power in the multiple rather than a singular solution. So to conclude, I thought this was kind of a fun slide. This is something that Leslie Loco said in her curatorial statement for the 18th Venice Architecture Biennale that just closed. And she described the exhibition as an agent of change, saying, "It's often said that culture is the sum total of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Whilst it is true, what is missing in the statement is any acknowledgement of who the we in question is. In architecture particularly, the dominant voice has historically been a singular, exclusive voice, whose reach and power ignores huge swathes of humanity, financially, creatively, conceptually, as though we have been listening and speaking in one tongue only. The story of architecture is therefore incomplete, not wrong, but incomplete. It is in this context particularly that exhibitions matter." So to conclude, I think through organizing these different event series, I've always framed them through the word new, as a provocation as to how these existing and alternative forms of knowledge that haven't been the norm are new to some, but are very embedded and old to others. And when you search the definition for the word new, there are two meanings that appear. The first describes the word as produced, introduced, or discovered recently, or now for the first time, not existing before, while the second says already existing, but seen, experienced, or acquired recently, or now for the first time. And it's the latter definition that interests me in terms of how these alternative ways of telling stories of the past, designing the future, or rethinking the present are suddenly more widely known, understood, and accepted, so that all these ideas that have been on the periphery can actually start to shift towards the center. So I guess to end it, I think the question that maybe we can discuss more is, what would it take for the so-called new or non-normative to become the norm? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Lina. You can present from wherever you want. So.
Some of you in this room might find this very surprising, but I'm actually very nervous. And there's a reason for that. I think this is the first time I've been invited to speak at something for my individual practice as opposed to part of a collective. But because I don't believe that to be entirely true, it's just something that I'm working on alone right now. Before I get into it and the practice, I'd like to queer the idea of a bibliography. And so those usually come at the end, but I want to start with it and say that my references and citations and everything that I know and that I've learned are as a result of Sally, George, Ahmed, Gulcher, Nadine, Abira, Sophie, and countless other names who I've been very lucky to have conversations with and be in community with, and have taught me things no book ever has. And without them, nothing I would have read in the books would have made sense anyway. So yeah, gonna put that up front. So I'm currently doing trying to do a PhD at SOAS that vaguely looks at the politics of knowledge production, which is very wide. But I'm in the gender studies program, but I want to tell you the sort of story as to how I came to do this PhD. I think like most people, I just didn't want to have to do a real job and not make any real money for a while, so, you know. That being said, my ability to do it now, it comes from both pain and privilege, right? I'm privileged that I don't have to make my career decisions around financially providing for others, for example, and I'm very conscious of that, and I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to do that. But it also came from a point of pain because I think, like a lot of people, I was having a bit of a mental breakdown in 2020. My medium is words, so I've read a lot of books, right? Like, I nerd out on stuff. Went to a bunch of therapists, read a bunch into like Western psychology. I've really tried to sit with myself and understand myself and pick apart the layers and heal my inner child. You know. She's not okay still. But, that's fine. So when I realized all of that was not working, I was like, okay, well, there's something in common in this entire paradigm, which is a fundamentally Western model of understanding the self, understanding problems, understanding our mental condition, and that is not necessarily the context that I come from. So, and I know it's quite new in the history of humanity and the timeline, these sort of like knowledge systems. I was like, let me see what, you know, civilizations that have been around for much, much longer, see what they've been saying about the self and the mental and all of that. So I started reading more along like spiritual lines, because again, I have to read through it to be able to practice it. And then I wanted more and more to get closer to something that was, you know, my culture, my background, my family, and I was trying to follow that thread backwards and that genealogy, and I found that it had been broken in multiple places. And so it had been broken through, you know, processes of modernizing, civilizing that a lot of the global South goes through. This idea that for you to be intelligent and employed and well-educated, you have to speak English, and now I think in English, and that's very weird. I have done for a while. And there was also a step before that where a lot of my family come from a rural background, but they had moved to the cities, they had become urban, and like in a lot of places in the world, rural people are considered to be the stupidest in a particular country, which also makes no sense. But because the standards they're being held against are ones around how well you can read and write books in English, and how many degrees do you have, and how well can you articulate yourself to as wide of an audience as possible on the internet, ideally. And the thing is like, I'd collected a bunch of degrees and read a bunch of books and still felt really stupid. And like, I didn't know anything and I didn't understand myself. And like, okay, so clearly this isn't it. And that's why I was like, let me do a whole PhD about it, because I can't, you know, like anything in a chill way. So I started doing that, and I started exploring it a little bit. And there are the obvious things that I think we all know is that we understand that there's a hierarchy of knowledge, like what I was just talking about, that the written word is considered the highest form of knowledge. Oral histories are not considered as valuable. And there is a primacy to visual everything. And so if my medium is words, and all of you, because I'm not an architect, all of you can like design and create visual things, we've denigrated the rest of our senses to a secondary importance, and every medium outside of the written word to secondary importance. And I think that's a form of self-amputation. And so because of all these disconnects and all these things we've discarded and thrown away and rendered unimportant in like an economy of knowledge and knowledge production, I felt incoherent as an individual, because I belonged to a genealogy that was not clear and could not be mapped. So I think some of the conclusions that are always incomplete, and I love that line of like, it's not wrong, it's incomplete, is that I am going to allow for unknowledge to be the highest form of knowledge. That knowing to knowledge should be like queering to queer, that it is a constant form of process and a constant form of being and becoming that cannot arrive anywhere, that once it arrives, that once it becomes a norm, it becomes violent and exclusionary to others, and that it is not until I am uncomfortable with not knowing and not being legible and not being coherent, and nobody, especially not minorities or marginalized people, owe that to anyone for their humanity to be recognized. But I think we've gotten so stuck in the identity categories of marginalization that we don't realize a lot of the violence is rooted in epistemic violence, and that the way we've structured up like social hierarchies and the power systems is very much around how we've been taught to think about the world, to think about ourselves, to think about others, and that for any sort of like queering of the future, that includes care, that includes more understanding of different knowledge systems and different cultures, we are going to have to get uncomfortable with not knowing and for things to be unintelligible, that nobody owes us that. For everything to make sense. That is a colonial move to power, to always categorize and make sense of and understand, and this fetishization of new knowledge and an accumulation of knowledge making you morally superior to others somehow drives me cuckoo. So yeah, that's the PhD. I've been very, very lucky to also been in a weird adjacent position at the AA, with one foot in, one foot out, like teaching as part of a team in previous units, now in HTS. And it's been really wonderful because these are normally worlds that are separated out by the higher education model. It's like, why would architects be talking to somebody from gender theory or gender studies? And they've been some of the most productive, beautiful conversations I've had, because I've learned just as much as somebody who thinks in like 2D words. My brain doesn't visualize. Being taught about how we can spatialize and emplace knowledge like that has been very powerful for me. And I hope that we can continue doing more of these exchanges. And I'll leave it on that positive note. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have one more speaker, Kiki, who's online.
Good evening, y'all. I want to say also as a bit of a preface that I'm also pretty nervous. I'm like a week-long corporate retreat, hence the beautiful hotel curtains behind me. And I'm trying to shake off all the corporateness so that I have the vulnerability to talk about what I want to talk about tonight, which I love talking about, but I think is also, it's heavy stuff, as will be seen. So I'm going to quickly share a slideshow. As shared, my name is Kiki Gilbert, and I'm both really excited, but also really grateful for the chance and opportunity to speak tonight about both my praxis and practice as far as archiving and poetry goes. Just to root myself in this space, in this digital space a bit more, and share a bit about where I come from. My folks are originally from the US South, but that's not already obvious from my accent. More specifically, I consider the US South to be the closest thing that I have to an ancestral homeland. My people are from Tennessee, a very small town called Pulaski, which is coincidentally also where the KKK was founded. Though I was primarily raised between North Carolina and Georgia. And I love the South a lot, which sometimes surprises the people that I come across. But I love how haunted it feels as a place. I love how thick the air is with its own sense of history, and I miss its rhythms. I miss all the ghosts. I miss its food as well, especially living in London. No disrespect intended. And I also, relatedly, my academic background is in like Black American history, but also philosophy, and I think broadly about the ethics of people who are marginalized and who are facing oppression at the hands of a violent state. Like what ethical frameworks look like under those conditions of structural violence and scarcity. And I also currently work as a community organizer between Croydon and Peckham, And all of these things, my sense of haunted Southerness, my commitment to justice, and my deep love and optimism as far as theory goes, show up in my poetic practice. And today, I specifically wanted to talk about the mediation of archival silences through my poetic practice. Sorry, I'm just setting a timer. And as you will see in this rather jumbled title, with its markings and parentheticals and all the question marks, and I had to restrain myself to only one question mark, this presentation and its questions and all the answers, they're very far from settled. This is poetry, after all, that's composite of other people's words, freedoms that are both urgent, but also feel very impossible. And it's very much a not quite resistance, a not quite retrieval of people's voices. As I will explore, I don't think that poetry is up to the task that I'm trying to burden it with, because I don't think that poetry has the power to peer into the past, to wrestle with a violence I still don't have words for, and to emerge victorious with all of the voices, perspectives, and the hopes of those who have been forcibly scrubbed from history. I don't think poetry can do it, but I think I must still try with poetry to do those things for reasons that are both deeply personal, but also agitating, as intuitive as they are political. During this talk, I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to gesture towards three things, because I'm also aware of how much time I have. I'm going to talk about Saidiya Hartman's concept of critical fabulation. I'm going to talk about the kinds of words that have been cemented in the mouths of Black women, particularly as it pertains to the 19th century. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about my own poetic practice and how this all ties in together into my poetry more directly. And to start, I'm actually going to go straight into Saidiya Hartman, who I think is absolutely brilliant. And I'm going to sit with a question or two questions that I think are as powerful as they are straightforward. And those questions are, how and why does one write a history of violence? And how do we revisit the scene of subjugation and subjection without replicating the grammar of it? In saying this, Hartman actually has in mind a woman by the name of Sarah Baartman, who might be familiar to some of y'all. So Sarah Baartman was infamously also known as like the Hottentot Venus, and she was an orphan from South Africa who was coerced really forcibly and violently to Europe, where she toured as part of an act that included a lot of sexual exploitation and violence. And the violence that Hartman experienced, as Saidiya Hartman puts really forcibly, is a kind of violence that we don't have the words to capture. It's a kind of violence that our words cannot stand up to. They will necessarily stagger and fail. But Hartman tries anyways. And the tool that she uses in order to approach what she thinks might be the boundaries of Sarah Baartman's experiences is the tool of critical fabulation, which basically combines like a creative outlet. So in my case, poetry, but also can be like long form literature or artwork or photography. And combines that creative outlet with history, with archives, and thinks really seriously about what isn't there, amidst all that is, amidst all the violence that is there, amidst the glimpses that we are able to see of other people's perceptions of, in this case, Sarah Baartman, but of other people as well. And I should also note, just because I think it's really important to know this, that after Sarah Baartman died at the very young age of 26, that her body was actually kept on display at the French Museum of National History for over a century until after she died, so until like the 1970s, which is one of the reasons why there's been a lot of work, and there was like such a resurgence of work to really sit with and think about the exploitation of Sarah Baartman, both like in the then past or the then present, but also like stretching into the contemporary moment. We're thinking about Black women and their bodies and how they're being received by really violent institutions. So when we think about the commodification of Sarah Baartman, and we think about the commodification of other Black folks and Black people and Black women and Black femmes, like during the 19th century, like during the active time of the transatlantic slave trade and all of its most immediate afterlives. We think about using, again, critical fabulation, how we can listen for the mutters and the oaths and the cries of those who are deemed and dubbed to be commodities. And this is where I think, again, that poetry came to me. But just to settle, or just to sit a bit more on like how words specifically can be manipulated in this way. I also want to look at a couple of archives that I personally have looked at as a researcher. So these archives are from a series of interviews that were taken by enslaved peoples, or at least they were presented as a series of interviews. It actually turns out that this was all one interview that was taken by a formerly enslaved man in the 20th century, so like the early 1900s. But it was edited in ways that like reinforced the message that the interviewer like wanted to reinforce. So the first quote is like the closest thing that we have to like the original quote from this interview. And then like there were like later iterations that were used to like retell the story that this original quote was telling. So as you can see here, it goes from like talking about songs no longer being available to the speaker, which could be gesturing towards a kind of despair. And recollecting only one song that comes to mind, which is a song about drinking of the wine, which could be like have religious connotations, I'm not entirely sure. But that transformed into a quote which is talking about freedom songs and freedom songs not being what was in like the vocabulary or like in like the repertoire of like enslaved people at the time, which is a ridiculous thing to say. And then afterwards, like just reinforcing, like going again about like how freedom like just wasn't of urgency. Freedom wasn't something that people were focused about during times of the transatlantic slave trade amongst people who were enslaved. So thinking about how in this case, like words are like playing a really like particular political function and are being used to tell a certain kind of narrative around enslaved peoples, and thinking this is only like one example that we have access to that we know has been directly manipulated, but this only like begins to like showcase just how many other like interviews of this sort, which were also like then kept in the National Archives Center in the US, were used to tell all kinds of stories about times and periods of enslavement in the US. Like we can only imagine how many other such quotes were distorted in this way. And then, okay, great. I also wanted to really quickly call attention to another quote, which is, I think, pretty famous, which is the beginnings of Sojourner Truth's anti-woman speech, which I taught about really extensively in an undergraduate course that I taught in when I was back in the States and like working with youth and like with students who were thinking about Black American history. And most all of them didn't know that that speech was actually like rewritten really extensively, not by Sojourner Truth, who wasn't herself literate, but by a white woman who was an abolitionist who was in the audience and like heard what she said she heard and then like rewrote this in a kind of like vernacular and like African-American English that actually Sojourner Truth herself wouldn't have spoken, given that she spoke Dutch English. So again, just thinking about words and the power for them to be distorted throughout time and how they end up getting passed down through history. And yes. So finally, moving on to poetry more directly. So thinking about archival poems as like an expression of a critical population and thinking about found poetry, I feel like there are ample examples that I also look to in my work when I'm like trying to think about how to approach, again, the violence that is like popping up again and again throughout history, while not trying to also replicate it, but just trying to like call attention to what's going on. And one of my favorite examples of this is a poem which is like speaking to the murder of a trans woman that was written in 2011. And I'll read it out loud because I really like this piece. And I will also say that this poem was initially and entirely written, because I think there's like another version of it out there, but this version was entirely written using language taken from the newspaper article that was written in the aftermath of the murder. And it says, Angie was female, the way she dressed, the way she carried herself, the way she went out in public. She carried herself as a woman. She was beautiful. Man arrested for transgendered murder, met on the internet, found by her sister severely beaten. Second-degree murder charge. And when I read this piece, it really struck me, and it actually inspired me to return to a newspaper article that I found written about one of my late ancestors, who was a woman named Caroline Button, who was apparently one of the oldest people who died in the part of Tennessee that my family is from, at about the age of like 110 years old, if the article is to be believed. And this article basically describes her being given a small house as a thanks for all the years of faithful service that she gave to the enslavers who enslaved her. And it really, really unsettled me when I first read it. It felt sticky on the skin. And so I kept trying to write and rewrite poems that were trying to sit with this violence and we're trying to like speak to this violence while also understanding that I could never retrieve the voice of even this ancestor of mine because of what had been done to her, because it had been lost, because the work of poetry as like intervention in archives is always going to be incomplete, is always going to be impossible. It will never be enough. But as I said again, it's something that I feel really compelled to do because I think it's important. And I'm definitely out of time, so I will stop there. Thank y'all.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much.